Something happened in Washington this year that almost nobody outside a handful of trade offices noticed. Senators from opposite ends of the political spectrum, people who agree on almost nothing, started sending nearly identical letters about the exact same country. Not China, Canada. And once you understand why, you will never look at a battery pack the same way again. For years, the story was simple. America blocks Chinese electric vehicles with massive tariffs, China tries to sell them anyway, end of story. But starting in early 2026, that story cracked open. Lawmakers in both parties began warning that the real fight was no longer happening at the border where finished cars cross. It was happening one layer beneath that, inside the wiring of the supply chain itself, in the minerals, the battery cells, and the ownership structures that most consumers never think about. This is not a story about secret plots. It is a story about a door that nobody sealed shut, and about what happens when three trade partners, three sets of rules, and one very patient competitor all occupy the same industrial ecosystem at the same time. So why did the alarm bell start ringing exactly now? On February 11th, 2026, 5 Democratic senators, including Gary Peters and Amy Klobuchar, sent a formal letter to the United States Trade Representative warning of what they called a clear and present threat. Their argument was blunt. Chinese automakers were rapidly increasing investment in production facilities in Mexico, and the risk of Chinese vehicles and components entering the American market was, in their words, no longer a future threat. It was already here. Then, less than 3 months later, on April 28th, 47 members of the House, Republicans and Democrats together, sent their own letter to the president demanding that vehicles built by Chinese-owned entities in Canada or Mexico be explicitly barred from qualifying for trade benefits under the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement. And by May 21st, 8 Republican senators fired off a third letter, this time aiming squarely at Canada, urging Ottawa to reverse a new deal it had just made with Beijing. 3 letters, different parties, same underlying fear. When politicians who disagree on almost everything suddenly agree on one narrow issue, that usually means something structural changed underneath them. So what actually is this so-called Canadian backdoor? It is not one thing, it is 2 things working together. The first is a very real trade decision. On January 16, 2026, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney announced what he called a new strategic partnership with China. Under that deal, up to 49,000 Chinese-made electric vehicles per year are now allowed into Canada at a low tariff of just 6.1%, replacing the previous 100% surtax that Canada had matched to American policy back in October of 2024. That quota is set to rise to 70,000 vehicles by the year 2030. In exchange, China agreed to drop retaliatory tariffs it had placed on Canadian farm exports. It was, in essence, a trade for a trade, agriculture for automobiles. The American Trade Representative Jameson Greer called the move problematic and publicly warned that Canada, quote, may come to regret the decision. But here is the part that actually worries lawmakers more than the cars themselves. Those Chinese electric vehicles entering Canada still face full American tariffs if they try to cross into the United States directly. So in theory, the back door for finished cars is still locked. The real concern is quieter and slower moving. It is about components. It is about battery technology licensed from Chinese firms being used inside plants that are technically owned by American or Canadian companies. It is about Chinese firms processing critical minerals that later get folded into what trade law calls North American content. None of that requires a Chinese badge on the hood of the car. It only requires Chinese fingerprints somewhere inside the supply chain, at a stage most consumers will never see. This is exactly why the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement suddenly became one of the most fought-over documents in North American politics. The agreement sets rules of origin, essentially a formula that decides how much of a vehicle has to be built in North America before it can cross borders duty-free. In its official autos report delivered to Congress on July 1, 2026, the Trade Representative's office made a striking admission. The share of American content inside vehicles produced in Mexico and Canada is declining, while the share of Chinese or other Asian content in those same vehicles is increasing. Read that sentence twice. It means the agreement built to strengthen North American manufacturing may be quietly allowing foreign content to ride inside vehicles that still get labeled North American. That is not smuggling. That is a rule book that has not caught up with a changing industry. Now picture the battery itself, because this is where the story goes from trade paperwork to something closer to national security. A single large battery plant, the kind now being built across North America, can cost more than $3.5 billion and cover roughly the footprint of 50 football fields laid end to end. These are not simple factories, they are strategic assets, closer in importance to refineries or power grids than to ordinary car parts suppliers. Under the Inflation Reduction Act, electric vehicles only qualify for consumer tax credits if a rising percentage of their battery components and critical minerals come from North America or trusted trade partners, climbing toward 100% for components by the year 2029. Starting in 2025, any battery containing minerals extracted or processed by what the law calls a foreign entity of concern, meaning China, Russia, North Korea, or Iran, loses eligibility entirely. That single clause turned lithium, cobalt, nickel, graphite, and copper into geopolitical currency almost overnight. And this is where Canada's true value becomes impossible to ignore. Canada holds meaningful global reserves of 5 of the 7 critical minerals used in electric vehicle batteries, including roughly 3% of the world's lithium reserves and nearly 2% of global nickel reserves. The Canadian government has committed to building 19 new midstream processing facilities to feed 4 battery gigafactories, including 5 plants for lithium hydroxide, 2 for lithium carbonate, 5 for purified graphite, and 7 for nickel sulfate. As of March 2025, Canada already operates 56 active mines and 31 processing facilities, with 171 additional projects advancing through development. 2 flagship battery plants are already reshaping Ontario alone. The Nexstar Energy plant in Windsor, now fully owned by LG Energy Solution after Stellantis sold its stake for a symbolic $100 in February 2026, and the Volkswagen PowerCo plant in St. Thomas, backed by nearly $5 billion in investment and expected to reach 90 gigawatt hours of annual capacity. Suddenly, a country most people associate with maple syrup and hockey has become one of the most contested pieces of real estate in the global battery race. So where does China actually fit into all of this today? Because the honest answer is more nuanced than most headlines suggest. As of July 2026, no major Chinese battery company has announced a wholly owned gigafactory inside Canada. BYD operates a bus assembly plant in Ontario that has existed since 2019, but it builds electric buses, not passenger vehicle batteries. CATL, one of the largest battery makers on Earth, has no Canadian manufacturing plant, but it does license its lithium iron phosphate battery technology to Ford for a $3.5 billion plant in Marshall, Michigan, which began production in June 2026, with CATL engineers reportedly assisting in construction and training. That arrangement is legal. Ford owns the plant, but it illustrates exactly the pattern lawmakers fear could eventually repeat itself north of the border. Technology and expertise flowing in through licensing agreements rather than direct ownership. A structure that can sidestep the plain language of foreign ownership restrictions while still giving a foreign company enormous influence over what gets built and how. Here is the deeper industrial logic, because none of this happens out of malice, it happens out of incentive. For China, licensing technology and processing minerals abroad is a way to keep earning revenue and market relevance even while facing tariff walls on finished vehicles. For Canada, welcoming that investment means jobs, mining revenue, and a shot at becoming North America's mineral processing hub. For American automakers like Ford, General Motors, and Stellantis, access to cheaper, already proven battery technology means lower production costs and faster paths to meeting the very tax credit rules Washington created. Everyone at the table is acting rationally according to their own interests. That is precisely what makes the situation so difficult to simply legislate away. If batteries are becoming the strategic assets that decide who wins the next decade of the auto industry, who actually ends up controlling them? The mines, the processing plants, or the companies assembling the final product? If cars are physically assembled in Ontario or Michigan, does that automatically mean the technology inside them, the intellectual property, the chemistry, the software, is truly American or Canadian? And if the United States can block a finished Chinese car at the border, can it really stop a Chinese-designed battery chemistry once it has already been licensed, localized, and built inside a factory carrying an American or Canadian flag on the front gate? Washington's current strategy is essentially to close the loophole before it becomes permanent rather than after. The Treasury Department's rules on foreign entities of concern already include what is called an effective control test, meaning that even without direct equity ownership, a Chinese company can still disqualify a battery from tax credits if it maintains a contract giving it functional control over production. The Commerce Department proposed rules in January of 2025 specifically targeting the technology inside connected vehicles, citing national security risks tied to Chinese software and hardware. And as of the joint review process in July 2026, American negotiators declined to simply renew the trade agreement in its existing form, instead pushing to tighten rules of origin specifically to prevent this kind of backdoor entry through Canada and Mexico. None of this means Chinese companies are currently breaking the law. Every expert who has studied the current rules agrees there is no verified evidence of Chinese firms illegally collecting American subsidies through Canadian operations today. What lawmakers are actually trying to prevent is tomorrow, not undo yesterday. And that is really the twist buried underneath all of this. This was never simply a story about electric cars, or even about China versus the United States in some straightforward trade war. It is a three-sided, sometimes four-sided negotiation between Washington, Ottawa, Mexico City, and Beijing, where every country is trying to lock in its advantage before the next set of rules gets written. Canada gets to leverage its mineral wealth. Mexico gets manufacturing investment. China gets market access without a Chinese badge on the hood. And the United States is racing to rewrite the rulebook fast enough to keep the value of North American manufacturing actually flowing to North America. The electric vehicle sitting in someone's driveway in 5 years may look completely ordinary, but the real competition was never just about who builds the car. It was always about who controls the materials, the factories, the technology licenses, and the logistics that make that car possible in the first place. And right now, that control is still very much up for grabs. If this kind of story, the ones hiding underneath the headlines everyone else is missing, is exactly what you want more of, so you are never caught off guard by what is coming next in the industry, join us here at Driven to Distraction.